by Phantom Vault.
History of the Echoes of Black Hollow Road. In the fall of 1994, a small town in West Virginia was haunted by a mystery that no one could explain. The local legend of Black Hollow Road had been whispered among the townsfolk for years, but it was often dismissed as nothing more than folklore. That is, until a group of 4 friends, Alex, Rachel, Tom, and Lisa, decided to prove the legend wrong. They would soon learn that some legends are rooted in terrifying truths. It all started when the 4 decided to go camping near Black Hollow, a secluded road that cut through miles of dense, ancient forest. Locals claimed the road was cursed, that people who traveled it would hear strange voices, and some would even vanish without a trace. Of course, Alex, the most skeptical of the group, found the stories ridiculous. Ghosts don't exist. It's just a road like any other. He laughed as they packed their gear into Tom's old Jeep. The others weren't so sure, especially Lisa. She had grown up hearing the stories and was reluctant to join the trip, but she didn't want to be left behind. They left the town behind as the sun began to set, the colors of dusk casting eerie shadows over the trees. The drive to the campsite was uneventful at first, but as they turned onto Black Hollow Road, the mood shifted. The trees seemed to close in around them, their twisted branches like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. The road was narrow and unpaved, the crunch of gravel under the tires the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. Suddenly Lisa spoke up, her voice shaky. "Do you hear that?" The others listened. At first there was nothing but the wind, but then faintly they all heard it, a soft, distant whisper, like someone calling from far away. "It's probably just the wind through the trees," Tom suggested, trying to sound confident. But the whispers grew louder, more distinct, as though someone or something was trying to communicate. Rachel, the most curious of the group, suggested they stop the car to investigate. Reluctantly, they pulled over, the headlights casting long, ghostly shadows on the road ahead. The 4 stepped out into the cold night air, their breath visible in the growing chill. As they walked a few steps from the car, the whispers stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then out of nowhere, the car's radio crackled to life, even though the engine was off. A low, distorted voice emerged from the speakers, whispering something unintelligible. The friends exchanged uneasy glances. "Let's just set up camp and forget about it," Alex insisted, already heading back to the car. They drove deeper into the woods and found a clearing where they pitched their tents. A small fire crackled in the center of the camp as they tried to shake off the unsettling events of the evenings. But the feeling of being watched lingered, heavy and thick in the air. Late into the night, they heard it again, the whispering. This time, it was closer, almost circling their camp. Lisa's face went pale. "We need to leave, now. We're not leaving because of some wind," Alex snapped. "It's nothing." But as soon as the words left his mouth, the fire flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. The whispers swirled around them, growing louder, more frantic. Tom grabbed a flashlight and pointed it into the trees. That's when they saw her, standing just beyond the tree line. A woman dressed in old, tattered clothes, her eyes hollow and vacant, her lips moving as though whispering something they couldn't hear. She was pointing toward the road. "Who the hell is that?" Rachel whispered, fear gripping her voice. The figure didn't move. She just stood there, pointing. Without another word, they scrambled to pack their gear, the urgency to leave overriding all other thoughts. But when they turned back to the car, it wasn't where they had left it. The jeep had vanished. Panic set in. "It was right here!" Alex shouted, running in circles around the campsite. "It can't just be gone. We need to get out of here," Lisa insisted, tears welling in her eyes. They decided to walk back toward the road, hoping to find their car, or at least get away from the presence that now seemed to be closing in on them. As they trekked through the dark forest, the whispers followed them, growing louder, until they felt as though they were surrounded by dozens of voices, all whispering in unison. Then out of the shadows, Tom suddenly stopped. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing ahead. Through the trees they saw a faint light. At first they thought it might be a house or another car. But as they approached, the truth became horrifyingly clear. It was their jeep, crashed into a tree, as if it had been there for years. The windows were shattered, the paint peeling, rust covering the once shiny surface. Inside the car, they could make out shadowy figures sitting in the seats, unmoving. "No way. That's our car," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. But before they could react, the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. The woman from the woods appeared again, standing next to the car. This time her mouth was wide open, her face twisted in agony as the whispers poured out of her. Without thinking, they turned and ran, back into the forest, away from the road, away from the car. But no matter how far they ran, the whispers followed, growing louder, more frantic. Finally, they stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin in the woods. Desperate for shelter, they rushed inside, barricading the door behind them. For a moment, it was silent. But then, from the darkness of the cabin, a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the cabin. They turned toward the voice, and standing in the doorway of the next room was the woman. Her hollow eyes locked onto them, and the last thing they heard before everything went dark was her voice, whispering their names. The next morning, the search party found the campsite. The fire was cold, the tents were still there, but the friends were gone. All that was left was the wreckage of an old jeep that hadn't moved in decades, and the whispers that still echoed through Black Hollow Road. History of the Shadows of Pine Brook Camp. They say the Pine Brook campgrounds are cursed. Tucked deep within the Appalachian Mountains, the camp had once been a popular summer destination. But over the years, a dark legend grew. People whispered about disappearances, strange occurrences, and shadows that moved on their own. The camp was eventually abandoned in the early 90s, left to rot as nature reclaimed the land. But the story I'm about to tell you, this one isn't just a campfire tale. This happened to me and my friends, and I still get chills thinking about it. It was the summer of 2005 when we decided to visit Pine Brook. My friends, Mark, Jess, and Tyler, were always up for exploring creepy places, and Pine Brook had been on our list for years. We'd heard all the stories about campers who had gone missing, and about the strange lights people reported seeing in the forest at night. But like most thrill-seeking teenagers, we didn't take the warnings seriously. We figured it would be a fun weekend trip, nothing more. We arrived late in the afternoon, the dense forest casting long shadows as the sun began to set. The camp looked exactly as we imagined. Dilapidated cabins with broken windows, overgrown paths, and an eerie silence that seemed to hang in the air. It was unsettling, but we were determined to stay the night. We set up camp in the largest cabin, its floor creaking under our weight as we moved our gear inside. The first few hours were uneventful. We explored the campgrounds, took pictures, and laughed about how ridiculous the stories seemed now that we were actually there. But as dusk fell, the atmosphere changed. "Did you guys hear that?" Jess asked, her voice trembling slightly. We all paused, straining our ears. At first there was nothing, just the wind rustling through the trees. Then we heard it, a faint, distant humming. It was low, almost like a chant, and it seemed to be coming from deep within the woods. "Probably just the wind," Mark said, trying to sound casual, but I could see the unease in his eyes. By the time night fully descended, the temperature had dropped significantly, and the once faint humming had grown louder. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like a song sung by unseen voices. We gathered in the cabin, sitting around a small fire we'd built in the old stone fireplace. "I don't like this," Jess whispered. "We should go." "Relax," Mark replied, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. "There's nothing out there. It's just an old camp, and we're letting our imaginations run wild." But none of us felt reassured. As the hours dragged on, the humming became unbearable. It surrounded us, coming from every direction outside the cabin, as if the entire forest was alive with it. Suddenly Tyler stood up, his face pale. "We're not alone," he said quietly, pointing toward the window. We all turned to look, and that's when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing just outside, barely visible in the darkness. Its outline was hazy, almost blending into the night, but there was no mistaking it. Someone or something was out there. "Who's out there?" Mark shouted, grabbing a flashlight and rushing to the door. Before we could stop him, he flung the door open and shone the light into the woods. The figure was gone. The humming, however, had stopped, leaving behind an oppressive silence that was somehow worse. Mark turned back to us, trying to smile. "See? Nothing but your imagination." He laughed nervously. We were all on edge, but we tried to shake it off. It wasn't until around midnight that the real terror began. Jess was the first to notice. "Guys, the fire," she said, her voice trembling. We looked at the fireplace. The flames were flickering unnaturally, bending in odd directions, as if something was sucking the heat away from them. Suddenly, a blast of cold air swept through the cabin, extinguishing the fire completely. We were plunged into darkness. "What the hell?" Tyler shouted, fumbling for his flashlight. As soon as the light flickered on, we saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures surrounded the cabin, their forms barely distinguishable from the night, but their glowing eyes, cold, empty, were unmistakable. They were watching us. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Jess's arm and pulling her toward the back door. We burst into the forest, the cold air biting at our skin as we stumbled through the underbrush. The shadows seemed to move with us, slipping between the trees, always just out of sight. The humming had returned, louder than ever, almost deafening now. "Keep moving," Mark shouted, but his voice was barely audible over the sound. We ran for what felt like hours, our legs burning, lungs aching, until we finally reached the edge of the forest. The humming stopped. The shadows, whatever they were, had not followed us past the tree line. We collapsed in exhaustion, too terrified to speak. The next morning we returned to the camp with the police, but there was no sign of the figures, no evidence of. The next morning we returned to the camp with the police, but there was no sign of the figures, no evidence of the strange events we had experienced. The only thing they found were our abandoned tents and gear, left as if we had never been there. I don't know what we encountered that night at Pine Brook Camp. None of us talk about it anymore. Jess moved away and stopped answering calls, and Tyler joined the military, hoping to forget what happened. Mark and I stayed in touch for a while, but even our friendship faded as the years passed. Still, every once in a while, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear it. The faint, rhythmic humming. And I remember. If you ever find yourself near Pine Brook, take my advice, stay away from the camp. Some places are better left forgotten, and whatever is hiding in those woods, it's still waiting. History of the Forgotten Path. There's a story about Camp Briarwood that most people in town refuse to talk about. It's buried under decades of whispers, hushed conversations, and warnings to stay away. The camp, hidden deep within the woods, was once a popular spot for families during the summer. But in 1987, everything changed. A group of campers went missing, and to this day, no one knows exactly what happened. The camp shut down shortly after, left to decay, swallowed by the forest. I didn't believe the stories. They seemed like exaggerated campfire tales. But last summer, my friends and I decided to visit Briarwood. We were bored, looking for some thrills, and exploring the infamous haunted camp seemed like the perfect adventure. There was 5 of us: me, Sarah, Matt, Rachel, and Jason. We didn't expect to find much. Maybe some old cabins, a few creepy pictures, and a good scare to laugh about later. We set out early in the afternoon, the sun high above us as we hiked through the dense woods. The trail to Camp Briarwood was overgrown, barely visible in places, but after a couple of hours, we found it. The camp was just as we imagined. Broken-down cabins, an old mess hall with shattered windows, and an overgrown field where kids must have once played. The air felt heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. "I don't know about this," Sarah said, fidgeting nervously as we entered the first cabin. "It feels wrong." "Come on, Sarah," Matt teased. "It's just an old camp. What, do you think the ghosts of campers are going to come out and get us?" We laughed, but even I felt uneasy. There was something about the silence that was unnerving. No birds, no insects, just the sound of our footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. We spent the next hour exploring, checking out the dilapidated buildings and taking pictures. But then, Jason found it, the path. Hidden behind a row of cabins, the trail was narrow and overgrown, disappearing into the forest. There was something strange about it, though. It didn't look like a regular hiking trail. The trees on either side seemed unnaturally close together, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sunlight. "Look at this," Jason said, pointing down the path. "Bet no one's been down here in years." "Should we check it out?" Rachel asked, her eyes lighting up with excitement. I hesitated. Something about the path gave me a bad feeling, but curiosity got the better of us. We decided to follow it, Jason leading the way, his flashlight cutting through the dimness as the forest grew darker. We walked for what felt like miles, the air growing colder with each step. The trees seemed to press in on us from all sides, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. I glanced at my phone, but there was no signal. That's when we heard it, a distant sound, like someone walking just out of sight. "Did you guys hear that?" Sarah whispered, stopping in her tracks. We all froze, straining our ears. At first, there was nothing but the rustling of leaves in the wind. But then the sound came again. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable, crunching on the forest floor. "Probably just an animal," Jason said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. We pressed on, but the further we went, the stranger the path became. The trees seemed older, their trunks gnarled and covered in strange markings, almost like symbols carved into the bark. A feeling of dread settled over me, but no one said anything. We were all too scared to admit that something was wrong. After what felt like an eternity, we came to a clearing. In the center was an old, crumbling stone well. It looked ancient, completely out of place in the middle of the woods. The air around it was deathly still, and I felt a shiver crawl down my spine. "Let's check it out," Jason said, stepping toward the well. "No," Sarah said firmly, grabbing his arm. "We need to leave now." "What's your problem?" Jason snapped, shaking her off. "It's just a well." But as he leaned over to look inside, something changed. The air around us grew colder, the forest unnervingly quiet. And then, without warning, Jason screamed. A guttural, terrified scream that cut through the silence like a knife. He stumbled backward, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "What did you see?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Something's down there," he gasped, his voice trembling. "I saw a face, pale, lifeless. It's staring back at me." Panic surged through us, and we all turned to leave the clearing. But the path was gone. The trail we had walked was no longer there, replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees. It was as if the forest had shifted around us, trapping us in the clearing. "This isn't happening," Matt muttered, running his hands through his hair. We were trapped, with no way out, and no idea what was lurking beneath the well. "We need to calm down," Rachel said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Let's think this through." But before we could come up with a plan, the footsteps returned. This time they were closer, much closer. We turned toward the sound, and that's when we saw them. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, were emerging from the trees, moving toward us with slow, deliberate steps. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her toward the far side of the clearing. We bolted through the trees, the shadows closing in around us, their shapes barely visible in the dark. The forest felt alive, like it was pushing us toward something, or someone. Out of breath and terrified, we finally burst through the trees, stumbling back onto the trail. Somehow we had made it back to the camp, though none of us could explain how. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. We never spoke about that day again. The camp, the well, the shadows, they were too much to comprehend. But something changed in each of us. Jason stopped talking about exploring abandoned places. Sarah refused to go camping ever again. And Matt left town and never came back. As for me, I still hear it sometimes. Those footsteps just outside my window at night. And every once in a while when I'm alone, I swear I can feel eyes watching me from the shadows. If you ever come across a forgotten path in the woods, take my advice. Don't follow it, because some places aren't meant to be found, and once they have you, they won't ever let you go.